Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I'm going to continue our study through Deuteronomy chapter 13, continue to ask what does it take to lure people away from the Lord. Yesterday we saw in these first 5 verses of this chapter how it talks about the prophetic voice, the sort of corporate, religious, personal approach of the person who stands up as a false prophet and people hear and heed his voice. However, Deuteronomy 13 verses 6 through to 18, the rest of the chapter, now confronts us with, initially, the more intimate scenario, presenting a stern warning about the seductive power of close relationships, charismatic personalities, and how they can draw us also into idolatry. In these verses we will see God command an unwavering allegiance to Him, even if that means making painful choices in how we respond to it. This passage challenges us all to examine our hearts and our relationships and to reaffirm our commitment to God above all else. And it gives us an insight into understanding the nature of true devotion. Now, this is a challenging and sobering text today, but in it we'll discover the importance of loyalty to God, and it might even give us the courage to stand firm in our faith when confronted by these false lies and seductions. We can stand firm no matter what the cost. So are you ready to hear and heed this call? The call to place God above all in your life? Well, let's explore exactly what that means in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, yesterday, as we began this chapter, my list consisted of 3 temptations that Moses presents as ways that can lure us away from the Lord. Theologians have called it the world, the flesh, and the devil. But Moses embeds it in much more specific scenarios. Moses started, as we heard yesterday, with the world of the false prophets, but there are 2 more warnings to come, and here's the first. Verses 6 to 9. If your brother, the son of your mother, the son of your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let's go and serve other gods, gods which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, or the gods of the people which are all around you, near to you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So the first 5 verses talked about this thing called the false prophet, but here we're clearly talking about a relative, a close friend. So it's getting much more up close and personal, isn't it? And he says, if such a person says to you secretly, we need to worship this God or that God, then, frankly, it says that we are to kill him. Wow. Again, let me remind you, we don't live in Moses' time. We're not called to kill people that way, but we are called, and what it means for us today under the New Covenant is to spiritually cut those people off. Now, it's interesting also to note, although it says that here, there is no case of this actually happening in the Old Testament accounts to follow. There's no account of them actually stoning any of these people or false prophets in the Old Testament. However, it is interesting to see that the nation of Israel put the true prophets in jail. But anyway, Moses is using this language to say, look just how serious this is. To lure someone away from God is literally as bad as murder. And this is a capital offence leading to a capital punishment. And the warning to us is don't be lured away from the Lord by such people. Now, there are a couple of interesting further observations to draw out of this text. In the case of the prophet, which we saw yesterday, it was all done very publicly. He stood up, says what he says, everybody sees it, and people respond individually to it. But here it specifically says, if someone secretly entices you, In other words, this is not a public affair, it's a personal, intimate matter. In this case, it's an individual, and he's offering a sort of temptation, a temptation to draw us away from living and serving the Lord and experimenting, if you like, by serving other gods. The other thing it says that's interesting to me is it says don't consent, don't listen, but also don't conceal or spare that person. We need to think about this for a second. If it's a relative or a close friend, of course, you might be more likely to be tempted not to do or to turn that person over as you would just a prophet who you didn't know. But it says here, not only don't listen to them, but also don't spare them. Don't conceal it. Don't let your eyes have pity on them. If this is a loved one, it even talks about someone as close as your spouse, and they're saying, don't serve the Lord. What's going to happen? Well, naturally, you might have pity on them. It's a wife or a husband or even a best friend. You might have pity, and you might not want to see them punished or cut off in this way. You might just hide the whole thing, cover it up. But Moses specifically says here, don't do that. He explicitly says it has to be dealt with because this is serious stuff. And then he spells out for us in verse death what's to happen. You ready for this? Stone them to death because they've tried to turn you away from the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. All right, I already mentioned that it said in verse 9 to put him to death. But notice here in verse 10 and 11, it talks about all the hands of the people being upon them. Purpose of this verse is to make us understand that this is a wider issue. It involves all of the people of the community. When you put verses 9 and 10 together, he's clearly drawing attention to the fact that this is not a personal matter, even though it may arrive on your plate as such. And I want all the people involved, all the people participating, everybody involved in casting their vote, so to speak, against this person and their attempt to lead you astray from worshipping the false god. You see, I think what it's getting at here is really trying to point out how one person's sin can affect a whole nation. So it needs to be dealt with on that wider community, even national issue. It's about all of the people. It's not about just you. This is a bigger issue than you or even your relatives. And he ends this section, verse 11, by saying, then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. So the principle of a deterrent is contained in this, isn't it? He's saying all the people are to be involved in this, because that way the responsibility of making that decision falls on all the people. And also the deterrent is there available to all the people. In this case, Israel will hear and will fear, and therefore they will be much less likely to be involved in such wickedness. This guy who's trying to lure this individual away from the Lord, the consequences need to be seen as a deterrent to all the other people, to deter them from doing such a thing. Now, I think it's interesting that he would say that in this passage, we're talking about a friend or a relative. That's the one who's trying to lure you away. So what does that mean today? I actually think today most people, more people certainly, get lured away from the Lord and from their Christian faith by their relatives, more so than false prophets. How many people I know who grew up in a church and in a Christian family, after they leave home, perhaps get married or go to university, they fall away from the Lord. Sometimes it's the new wife or the partner that takes them away. So I do think that this is relevant as today's newspaper. This kind of stuff is still happening today all around us, particularly to young people. It can be the prophet, but it's more likely to be the close friend or relative who's going to lure an individual away from the Lord. You know, during my years, I've also occasionally met with broken-hearted ministers who have felt unable, constrained to deal with very clear sin in their church because of the individuals have relatives on the leadership, on the diaconate, the board, the eldership of the church. And sadly, I can tell of you I can testify to you, I've seen whole churches destroyed and brought down because of the decision of that church to put their family members above what is best for that whole church community. Now, I visited quite a few churches over the years, and sometimes I walk away thinking sometimes there are individual families that control some churches. Now, of course, sometimes that's for good, but also, sadly, it's sometimes for ill. I do notice I sometimes come across not just powerful men, but powerful women who literally control whole churches. They may be church secretaries. They may be even just people who lead worship. And these people, you know, the minute you meet them, you dare not cross them. And I think it is this kind of stuff this passage is talking about, and how the potential for that type of situation to be abused. But there is a third possibility of how we might be lured away from the faith in the Lord, and that is probably the biggest and most riskiest to the wider church. You see, the first was to lure people away from their faith through this thing called the worldly false prophet. The second is to be seduced away by a close friend or family member. But let's look at this third possibility. Look at verse 12. If you hear it said about one of the towns the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that troublemakers have arisen among you and have led the people of their town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods you have not known. I'll just stop there. So clearly this case is talking about a community, a town, where a charismatic person has arisen and convinced a whole city or a community to fall away from the Lord. Someone has apparently successfully led an entire town into apostasy, and this whole town has now been caught up with it. Let's see how we can put this into perspective of what Moses is trying to get at in this chapter. First of all, in the first case, it was a prophet, wasn't it? That who would only affect an individual one at a time as they personally responded to that prophetic message. In the second case, we saw it was a relative or a close friend, which might involve seducing you or perhaps your family, your wider small group away. But now the passage is talking about a whole city. The whole city, the whole community has been lured in this example into not serving the Lord. So hear what he says in verse 14. Then you must inquire, probe and investigate it thoroughly. And if it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done among you, you must certainly put to the sword all who live in the town. You must destroy it completely, both its people and its livestock. Wow. The call is to wipe out the whole city here, because all of them have been caught up in this false teaching, this heresy. But notice what it says in verse 14. You first shall inquire and probe and investigate diligently, and it is indeed true. And this describes what we today call due process. Just because someone was accused of something, in this case we're talking about they're being accused of leading a whole city astray, you can't just accept any of these situations on face value. You've got to go search it out, inquire, find out where it's true. And actually, in the world today, we simply call that due process. As a matter of fact, most Western democracies and their legal system is based on this Judeo-Christian value system, and it basically all comes out of the Mosaic laws. And one of the points of those legal systems is there should be due process. It mentions here and in other places that in order to prove something, 2 or 3 witnesses are needed. So you've got to have proof that someone is guilty of something before you can convict them. And this is saying the same thing in just another way. There must be a confirmation, it says, through a thorough investigation before the decision is made of the judgment to fall. And what it's saying in this passage is this whole city of Israelites, Jews in Moses' times, this whole city has become guilty, and then treat them like Canaanites. And that punishment, it should be to treat them as those other cities were treated. Now, in the modern example of this would be an entire church community going off the rails. I had a friend, a Nigerian Christian, who had responsibility for a denomination of over 200 churches in that country, and some of the churches got into what was called angel worship. And after attending church meetings, church worship services, the decision was made to remove those churches from the wider group of other churches and denominations, to cut them off completely. But then there's this little bit added in terms of how you respond to it. Yes, you're to destroy the cities, but it says this: you are to gather all the plunder of the town into the middle of the public square and completely burn it down, all its plunder as a whole, as an offering to the Lord. The town is to remain a ruin forever, and you are never to rebuild it. Now, if you look at the details of this passage, he said to destroy all the people, all the livestock as well, and to take all the material plunder and put it in the middle, and then burn the whole thing all together. Now, this is obviously dramatic, severe stuff, but burning the town down and burning the plunder means that the people who are doing this and called to doing this, they're not going to benefit from it in any way. They won't be able to get to take home any of the stuff attached to this town, this city, this community. So, of course, that by nature precludes any temptation to greediness or any, how shall we say, illegitimate motivation for carrying out these various serious actions. There's got to be due process, and if it's decided, then everything is to be destroyed. And then verses 17 and 18 concludes all this by saying, and none of the condemned things are to be found in your hands. Then the Lord will turn from his fierce anger, will show you mercy and have compassion on you. He will increase your numbers as he promised an oath to your ancestors, because you obey the Lord your God by keeping all his commandments that I am giving you today and doing what is right in his eyes. So what he's saying, if you get rid of all this stuff, if you cut off all this false stuff, then the Lord is going to turn away from his fierceness and anger of the wider community, which of they were previously part, and he's going to show mercy and compassion to those who've remained faithful to them. In fact, more than that, he's going to bless them, and he's going to multiply them. So this is the reason that we need to be doing this spiritually. We need to be obedient to his command, to be diligent in, how shall we say it, our moral cleansing of the church, of the Christian community, in order that we can continue to experience spiritual renewal and, by nature, experience God's blessing amongst us. Now, by the way, the closest thing to this actually happening in the Bible from this point forward is when a whole city of Israelites is actually wiped out in the book of Judges. Now, I know that situation isn't exactly the same parallel. It's not exactly the same thing. In this case, it was more about dealing with sexual immorality, but there is that example where we see a whole community, a whole city wiped out. Now, I think it's also to note that from my knowledge, from this point forward, that is the only time this happens to that extent in the Bible. Certainly to God's people anyway. So what that tells me, because God is speaking to his people, this is meant to be coming from a perspective of fatherly discipline, with a view to correction and protection of the wider community as a whole. As I mentioned a moment ago, it seems to me as you work through this entire chapter, as we've done over the last 2 days, the point Moses is dealing with here is that the influence gets bigger and bigger, therefore the consequences get bigger and bigger. First, it's just one individual being influenced by a prophet. And isn't that how most people as individuals are led astray today? Maybe finding that prophetic voice on the internet, listening to it, staying in that echo chamber, the algorithms leading you to hear more and more of the same, and leading that individual astray, sometimes today in the quietness of their own room, to an individual, to the individual influencing in another individual within a family, thereby affecting that family group, to now we're dealing with someone who is influencing a whole large group, a wider group, a whole community, a whole town, a whole city, a whole church, a whole denomination. Does that happen today? Well, of course it does, in many and different ways and variable levels. How about going to college? How many young people grow up in a Bible teaching family or church, and then when they go off to college or university, they end up denying their faith? Would that not be a parallel situation? People get caught up in the group and deny the Lord. The group identity in our modern universities is far removed from that days of when I was growing up. In many of our UK universities and schools, there are no Christian unions, no Christian expression of any sort at all. In fact, many of what we call our high schools here don't allow them. But this tells me that Christians, we are to remain vigilant, and we are to separate ourselves from these false teachers, these secular communities that stand in opposition to the God, except, of course, maintaining good relationships underneath, motivated by the purpose of evangelism or the ability to present the Bible as relevant in the areas that the other people's lives are moving in. Perhaps saying, look, this is what I believe you believe, but look and see what the Bible has to say about these things. In doing so, we need to be aware that these very types of secular environments are the main sources from which the temptation to depart from the Lord can arise. It's also worth noting that Israel, in spite of the warnings given by Moses here today, pretty much failed to apply the commands of this chapter for the most part in their subsequent history. Their failure will result in both the northern kingdom and later the southern kingdom being taken into exile. And we see this sort of discipline that God has described as applying to others, applying to them as the consequences of their action. In the New Testament, in some cases, Paul actually says, remove yourself from them, to hand them over to Satan for their own destruction of their own flesh. Their sin will lead to their own end. Okay, what about the application of all this that come out of this? That's what I want to end with. What's the chapter talking about? Well, it's talking about the possibility of both prophets, close friends and relatives, neighbors, leading you astray. And also saying that if such people are identified after due process and they're found guilty of such, then they are worthy of being cut off and destroyed. Now, I began today by asking, what does it take for you or someone else to be lured away from the Lord? And I suggested that it tells us here the word, the flesh, and the devil. Things like possessions, things like pleasure, things like pride, any and all of these could be a factor. But if you think about this passage and what it really boils down to in the simplest, irreducible minimum, I believe it teaches that basically what leads people away from the Lord is in fact incorrect relationships. It could be a prophet, an internet personality you admire, or even a family member, perhaps even your spouse, your own child, your brother, or your closest friend. But also, in this final section, it says you can be led astray, friends, by being caught up in the crowd. The Bible is very clear about all of this. We should be very careful about who our closest friends are. Be friendly with everyone, love everyone, but be cautious and don't let them lure you away from the Lord. Rather, draw them towards the Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33 warns us to do not be deceived. Evil company can corrupt good habits. Now, in 1 Corinthians, Paul is dealing with people denying the resurrection and warning others in the Corinthian church not to be lured away from them because of their previous close relationship with them. It now will be something that could corrupt them. So don't get caught up in the prediction of false prophets, friends. Don't get drawn away by a wrong relationship, even with a close relative. And also don't get drawn away by the desire to feel accepted and have the conformity of the crowd. All of these are incorrect relationships, all of which can draw you away from the Lord. Now, when we live in a time where the crowd, the herd mentality, has moved many, many people away from the Lord, and young people especially. They're being caught up in the crowd and taken away from their faith of their childhood, and we need to be mindful about that. Now, recently, I stumbled across a story what I think dramatically illustrates how people can be caught up in this herd crowd mentality, and it can lead you and many people, a whole society, in fact, astray. So I'd like to close by illustrating it with a story of what you may be familiar with, particularly our American listeners, of what is called the Mississippi Company. In the 17th century, the Mississippi Company was a pet project of a flashy, dodgy wheeler-dealer character named John Law. Law fled his native Scotland after killing a man in a duel over a failed business venture, some would say a debt, and he fled to France. And whilst there, he somehow managed to get an introduction to King Louis XV, who at that time was only a young teenager. Law convinced the Prince Regent that he could solve France's huge national debt problem by simply printing paper money. Now, that was a relatively new idea at the time, and today we still do that, friends. You may have heard it. It's called quantitative easing. Now, the Regent was impressed and gave Law complete control over the Royal Bank of France and the Royal Printing Press, and soon Law was busy creating paper money and distributing it everywhere. And he himself became an incredibly wealthy and influential man during that time. But of course, by doing that, he embedded inflation into that economy. But before that began to bite, riding high on his success, he announced his next big project, the Mississippi Company, to bring back what he said would be fantastic treasures from the Mississippi River area, which he believed, without any particularly strong evidence, would be rich in silver and gold. Now, despite Law never having been to Mississippi, or anywhere, in fact, in what was called the New World, the Americas, he convinced the public in France using his charisma and his amazing, engaging public speaking skills. Parisians believed these fantastic stories and the promise of the wealth to come, and they rushed to buy shares in this company, driving up the price until it was worth more than all the money and the gold reserves held in France, the money in circulation and the gold in reserve. This one company, built on an empty promise, had a greater value. More money was invested in it than the value of the entire French economy at that time. It came to become known as what was called Mississippi fever. People selling stuff, investing their entire life savings based on nothing else than Law's assurances alone. Not even any real information given to back it up. Well, the inevitable happened. The bubble burst, and the truth about the company being a sham built on nothing came out, and the population, most of the population, lost their life savings. The French economic and the banking system collapsed, and Law went from being a hero to a villain. Now, does that sound familiar? Have similar things happened again and again in history ever since? Of course they have. That's a powerful illustration of how, even beyond an entire city, can be caught up in believing in something that actually doesn't exist, leading to devastating consequences. That made me think about, has this happened before? Will it happen again? Well, listen to this for a litany of failure. The tulip crash in Amsterdam. Tulip bulbs were exchanging hands, one bulb, for more than 2 years' wages. That led to a crash. The South Sea bubble. Situation in France, the South Sea bubble was burst, causing the UK economy to crash. Then we have the Great East India Bengal bubble crash of 1769. The panic of 1873 in the USA, leading to bank failures, following by a 4-year depression, the first of US's Great Depressions. They didn't have to wait long to the Wall Street crash of 1925 and the Great Depression, for 10 years, still regarded as the worst economic crisis in history. But it's not confined to history, friends. In 1970, we had the energy crisis and the OPEC oil price shock. And then, a little nearer, maybe some of you will remember Black Monday, 1987, the US and European stock market crashes. Maybe you're a bit younger than that still, but you might remember the dot-com bubble crash of 2000 to 2002 were overvalued. Early internet companies crashed to 5–10% of their previous value. But we don't have to go back far. I'm sure most of us remember the 2008 financial crisis, the collapse of the banks, and the unsecured lending to people with not enough income on properties that were overvalued. We're still feeling the effects of that today. And how about in 2020, the crash of OneCoin, the cryptocurrency crash, where an estimated 45 billion was completely lost or even perhaps stolen? But it is not just in financial matters that herd mentality can strike. The real point here is to be warned that we as the faith community need to be aware, because throughout church history, herd mentality has also led to catastrophic spiritual consequences. Just as serious, you might say more serious, than the financial disasters I've just discussed. One for me of the most profound examples, I would suggest, comes from the Crusades, but one particular aspect of it. I wonder if you've heard of it. Have you ever heard of the Children's Crusade of 1212? Thousands of children, young teenagers, inspired by charismatic church leaders and a collective fervor, gathered together all over Europe and embarked on a perilous journey to reclaim the Holy Land. Children, misled by false promises and a misguided zeal, many perished, and nearly all of the thousands who went were obviously captured and sold into slavery. Imagine sending a children's army to war. These tragic events and others are meant to serve as a reminder of the dangers of blindly following the crowd without using real biblical discernment. More recently, in the 17th century, the Salem witch trials provided another stark warning. There, a community driven by mass hysteria and fear in the colonial area of Massachusetts condemned, no doubt, many innocent people to death based on unfounded accusations of witchcraft. These trials are another chilling example how collective fear and paranoia can lead to gross injustices and spiritual devastation. But it's not just history. In my lifetime, I very well remember the cult movements of the 20th century, such as the Jonestown Massacre in 1978, where 900 followers of Jim Jones were persuaded to commit mass suicide together, again demonstrating the extreme consequences of choosing to follow a charismatic leader without critical thought, without testing it against the Word of God. And then even more recently, I'm sure most of you will remember the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. These movements often always start with appealing promises by a false prophet or creating a sense of belonging, but end in tragedy as followers are gradually led further and further away from the truth. These historical events should underscore for us the importance of vigilance and discernment in our spiritual lives and dealing with these issues straight away as they arrive, as described here in this chapter of Deuteronomy. We need to be reminded not to be swept away by popular opinion, not even charismatic leaders, not even charismatic preachers, because these are the people who might lead us astray if we don't use the God-given discernment that we've been given by the Lord. We need to ground ourselves in the Word of God and maintain a personal, authentic relationship with Him. Now I submit to you today that the most dangerous of all, because it has the widest effect, is of people being caught up in the crowd, believing in other gods that don't exist, and it's going on both inside and outside the church. But we're simply called to remain faithful, be vigilant, be cautious about the relationships that influence our lives, and always ensure we stay true to what the Lord is telling us. So ultimately, as we conclude today, this challenging chapter, I do believe we can still take heart from the lessons contained within it. We are called and equipped here to discern the spiritual truth, to test the spirits, and to hold fast to the truth of the gospel. And by doing so, He will protect our faith and ensure that our lives are a testament to God's unwavering truth and love. Remember, friends, your ultimate allegiance is to God alone, not to anybody else, no matter how charismatic they may appear, no matter how many of your friends or other people are doing it. Our responsibility is simply to guard our hearts and minds through Jesus Christ against any influence that would lead us astray from that core position. So let's believe it, friends, and let's use this chapter to encourage one another to stay vigilant, remain faithful, and simply continue to grow in our devotion to the Lord. Thanks for being with me today. Every individual is unique. An obvious illustration of this is our fingerprints. No two are the same. But spiritually, those who know the Lord are unique as well. And as a community of faith, we are also distinct from other religions and non-religious people. This uniqueness should be evident in our behavior. In the Old Testament, God's people were distinctly different from those around them, which has been easy to see as we've worked our way through these Old Testament books. In the New Testament, the distinction is less pronounced, but it's still clear and powerful. Today, friends, we're continuing to explore and work our way through Deuteronomy, and we've reached chapter 14, where the point is being made now by God through Moses that Israel is and must remain unique, different and distinct from all these other nations and religions that will be around them when they enter the Promised Land. The question is then, what makes them different? And how does this apply to us now? And that's what we're going to look at today in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now, before diving into the passage, it's worth me noting again that many commentators believe these chapters parallel the Ten Commandments, and that's certainly part of what's going on here. Some suggest that the first part of this passage we looked like corresponded yesterday to the third commandment, you shall not take the name of your Lord your God in vain, emphasizing treating God himself as special and unique. The latter part today is thought to parallel the fourth commandment, you shall observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In Deuteronomy, we'll see three ways Israel was to be distinct. So let's examine these distinctions and the way God's people can stay a holy people. Firstly, it talks about pagan practices. Deuteronomy 14, verse 1, we hear God speaking through Moses, saying to the children of Israel, you are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead. Now that might seem odd to us at first glance. However, throughout these passages we've got to recognize that the context of that time is critical in our understandings. Of course it has applications for us today, but the context here was Israel is about to enter Canaan, and the Canaanites practice cutting themselves, scarring themselves, and they also shaved their heads for the dead as part of their mourning rituals, which themselves were linked to idolatry. And God commands Israel not to partake in these practices because they are the sort of things that are going to be going on all around them when they enter the land. And verse 2 explains the reason they are to behave differently. It says, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all of the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. So Israel is to remain distinct and demonstrate their faith and uniqueness by refraining from these pagan practices around them. As God's chosen people, Israel does have a special relationship with him, and this unique position meant that they were to avoid the practice that would undermine their distinctiveness, their separation unto the Lord, and that was to be evident in every aspect of their life, including the way they practiced important life stages, including how they mourned for the dead. God wants them to be a light to these other nations in the land they're going into, drawing people to him through their uniqueness. This lesson extends to us today, of course. We too are called to be holy. We're told to be set apart from the Lord. Our behavior, our choices in life, our practices should also reflect our unique relationship with God. We too are his treasured possessions, and our lives should demonstrate that we actually serve and belong to him. And by refraining from the world's practices around us, anything that conflicts with our faith, we are, of course, at the same time showing our unique identity in Christ. We are called to be in the world, but not of the world, as it says in the New Testament, living out our faith in a way that draws others towards the Lord. So as New Testament Christians, we should embrace our distinctiveness and live as holy a life as we can as people dedicated to God. All right, I mentioned earlier this chapter outlines 3 ways Israel was to be distinct. We've already discussed the first point. God does not want his people to partake in the pagan practices, the religious practices of the others around them. Moving on to the second point, it pertains to dietary laws. Now, we've all heard about clean and unclean foods in the Bible. What does it mean? What does it mean when God says you can't eat this animal, but you can eat that one? Well, let's try and work out what's going on and what it means for us today. Verse 3, for short verse, states, do not eat any detestable things. Now, the word detestable, sometimes translated as an abomination, something disgusting. Now God will designate certain animals, certain fish, birds, etc. as detestable and not detestable. And in verse 4, God gives the list of animals the Israelites may eat. Verses 4 to 6 says, these are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. So these are the animals that they're allowed to eat. Additionally, it was clarified that they, as well as the list, any animal is mentioned with a cloven hoof or that chews the cud. However, now verse 7 lists some animals they cannot eat, despite having perhaps some of these characteristics. However, of those that chew the cud or have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel, the rabbit, or the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean, although it has a divided hoof and it does not chew the cud. You are not to eat the meat or touch their carcasses. So the Israelites are told here not to eat the flesh of any of these unclean animals or touch their dead carcasses. The distinction between clean and unclean animals is another way it's going to serve to set apart Israel as different from the other nations around them. These dietary regulations were a reminder again of their unique relationship with God and their call to holiness. Now we see in verses 9 and 10 that this dietary law extends to fish. Of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales, but anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat, for it is unclean. So fish without fins and scales, one would assume that's referring to shrimp, lobster, scallops, oyster, crabs, all that sort of thing. They are considered unclean at this point. The restriction then continues with some birds being mentioned in verses 11 through to 18. You may eat any clean bird, but these you may not eat are the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, the black kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the great owl, and the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the cormorant, the stork, and any kind of heron, and the bat. Not sure any of us would miss the bat particularly, eh? Now, this contains many birds, flying animals that the Israelites are not allowed to eat. Now, some of the birds are difficult to identify today, but most of the modern translations have a stab at it, as this New International did today. But regardless of the individual birds and what they are, and flying creatures, It is the principle that is important here, and it is the principle that would remain for these people for thousands of years. You see, God's dietary laws are not merely about health. They, of course, have some health benefits, but these laws were primarily about obedience and holiness. They were to be a constant reminder for the Israelites, again, to be distinct from the surrounding nations and dedicate themselves to the Lord. Now, as we reflect on these dietary laws today, we can draw parallels to our own lives. Now, of course, we're no longer under these Old Testament dietary restrictions, but the principle of being distinct and holy remains. What this, I think, is referring to is today is the fact that we are called in a way that sets us apart as God's people by the choices we make. Our choices, whether it be what to eat or not to eat, what to put in our bodies, in the wider aspects of overabuse of substances that will damage us, how we behave, in fact, even the values we hold, should all reflect our commitment to God. And by obeying God's command and living according to his standards, that's the important thing, we are demonstrating our unique identity as his people, as his children, to those people who are not his children. So to apply the lesson we've learned here in this list of prescription, the dietary laws, in the new covenant way, it is simply a call to holiness and to strive to live our lives and honor and glorify him in all the decisions that we make. Okay, a few more dietary restrictions are added in verse 19. It says, all flying insects are unclean to you. Do not eat them, but any winged creature that is clean you may eat. So what God has done with the land animals and the sea creatures, he now does with the birds, and now we see even the flying insects are mentioned. And he's made two categories in every group of animals, fish or birds, clean and unclean. Clean. You can simply eat the clean ones, but you can't eat the unclean ones. Now, you might go and try and figure out the specifics of each animal, but the bottom line is that there's classification going on here. A dividing line's been set between clean and unclean. And in this passage we've just been through, 21 animals are listed. It included not only animals, fish and birds, but also we now see insects. It seems pretty much that flying insects that swarm are seen as unclean, while locusts, crickets, grasshoppers are separated out as clean and could be eaten. Essentially, again, all animals and now insects classified into clean and unclean. But there's another point added from verse 21. Do not eat anything that you find already dead. You may give it to a foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any foreigner, but you are God's holy people, to the Lord your God. And then a final phrase, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So even if an animal was on the clean list, we see if it dies on its own, what we today might call roadkill, it's not to be eaten. So this statement is particularly interesting. Whilst the animals couldn't eat any animal that died of its own accord, in other words, a carcass of a dead animal, they could give it and sell it to a foreigner. Now that might seem strange, but not if you approach this passage with the understanding that all of this is meant to reinforce the idea that this is actually about Israel's uniqueness, distinctiveness, and the holiness more than anything else, more than the innate danger or health aspects of eating the animals that are unclean or in this way. That may be a benefit of it, but it's more about creating the two distinctions between the people. And in this final rule, as mentioned, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, again, this is relevant to the situation here, the context. This was, in fact, the practice of the Canaanites. And some historians and Bible experts believe it was a superstitious ritual that was carried out in order to what they believe would increase their fertility and the productivity of the land. So again, God commands the Israelite not to engage in such pagan practices, and he's mentioning stuff that is within the context of the land they're going into. So the big question is, why did God make these distinctions between clean and unclean? Why are certain foods forbidden? Well, there are four views on this. One, the first, is less common, and that it is a complete arbitrary distinction. It's simply a way to teach Israel that God's selection set them apart. And that is certainly true. But the three most common explanations that sort of widen that aspect or you want was one, identifying things as pagan practices that shouldn't be done. Some suggest that all the forbidden foods were associated with pagan worship. However, I would say that explanation doesn't cover all the animals listed. We know already that the bull, which was both used in pagan worship and in the worship of the children of Israel, is permitted as a food. Another popular explanation is hygiene. It posits that all this was so that certain foods were prohibited for health reasons. For instance, fish without fins or scales are known to carry bacteria. And eating them today, we have strict hygiene rules on their storage and preparation. Birds of prey, because they eat off carcasses, can of course catch and spread diseases, and shellfish are known to contain certain toxins. Now, of course, that explanation has merit, and much of it is true, but it doesn't fully align with the biblical context across all these examples that have just been given. For me, the most compelling explanation from my perspective is that these dietary laws were, yes, a combination of these things, but overall they were meant to be symbolic. They were meant to illustrate Israelites' holy call to be holy, set apart, distinct from other nation. In other words, God wants people to live differently in the context in which they live, and their diet was one of the ways to manifest this distinctiveness. Now, to illustrate this and how this changes in the New Covenant, Jesus is seen to declare all foods clean in the New Testament in Mark 7 and 19. And you will know, and we'll be doing it in the next month or so, Peter's vision in Acts 10 also clearly emphasizes this new perspective, showing that the dietary laws, clearly, if they could be rescinded and replaced and put aside, were not primarily about health or these other things, but actually at core were simply about holiness and separation. The purpose of the laws were not to promote health, not primarily anyway, although clearly that would have been a side benefit. The primary reason was to create a unique identity for God's people, setting them apart from the other nations and people around them. God wants his people to be distinctive. That carries over from Old Covenant to New Testament. So in spite of all these dietary laws here, we must understand the emphasis is ultimately, symbolically, on spiritual maturity and obedience, as the way Israel then and us today set ourselves apart as people of the Lord. Now, back in Deuteronomy, in verse 22, a third thing is seen that God asked the Israelites to do. And this is to do with tithing. Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that you produce each year. Now, the Jewish interpretation of this verse is that it refers to what's called the second tithe. I'll say more about that in a minute. You see, the Jews saw 3 different tithes in the Old Testament. And I also, do you remember I mentioned when we started today, I mentioned that this passage is sometimes applied to the 4th commandment. Well, this is the point where I believe it really starts to do that. The point is, listen to verse 23. And you shall eat before the Lord your God, and in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain, and your new wine, and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds, and your flocks, that you might learn to fear the Lord your God always. So this is an interesting aspect. When they get into the land, God is going to pick a place, and he's going to put and establish his name. We will see that happen, with of course it settling, and the people and the worship settling around Jerusalem later. And he's saying, what I want you to do is when you get to that place, you reap the crops, take 10% of them, go to that place where I've established my name and have communal meals there. But take 10% of all you produce and then go, let's say, to Jerusalem and sit down together. And then this interesting twist about tithing 10% of the fruits of their labor and their produce to be put aside. Now, of course, this would be a problem if you lived hundreds of miles away, as many did as they spread throughout the land. For you to have to take 10% of your crops and herds and haul them all the way to Jerusalem, that indeed would be a chore. So God here is going to make provision for those people and how they're to do that. Verses 24 to 27 says this: But if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God, and you cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is far away, then exchange your tithe, that's the goods and the crops of the land, for silver, and take the silver with you, and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, anything you wish. Then you or your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotments or inheritance of their own. Now, it's a bit detailed here, but in other words, it's saying, if you live wherever you live and say you're 100 miles away, then take money in your hand when you go to the place where the Lord has chosen. Then, when you get there, you can spend the money, so you can turn your original crop, your tithe, into money, and then you can spend the money for whatever your heart desires, he says. Oxen, sheep, wine, or a similar drink, whatever your heart desires. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. So this is interesting, and it's nuanced, isn't it? And it doesn't really tie in with what we hear taught sometimes about tithing in the New Testament context. But here, I believe, is the deal in all this. If you live far away and you can't haul the 10% of your crops or your herds, then sell them, go to Jerusalem and take that money you got from selling that portion, that tithe, and buy, well, I find it fascinating. It says, buy whatever your heart's desires. Just go to Jerusalem, take part in the celebrations, have a great time, whether it be with oxen, sheep, wine, anything you like. Now, as an aside, I think the Bible teaches here that as Christians, we don't have to teach a rule of total abstinence. Now, I myself have chosen to be abstinent from alcohol since 1999-2000, but that's because at that time God chose me to have a pastoral role and a supportive role among people with alcohol and addiction problems, and under the basis of you shouldn't do anything in your life that would cause your brother or sister to stumble. I made that decision. It was a personal decision for me, and I've never regretted it. But the Bible, as a principle, only teaches moderation, self-control, not addiction. But abstinence from anything that might be a potential risk to us or cause offense or lead others astray. Maybe perhaps you've noticed there's a distinction between wine and strong drink. And the expert view is that wine is something that was referring to something made from grapes, and strong drink was any fermented alcoholic drink made from grain, fruit, or even honey at that time. But the point of all this in this passage is that he wants them to tithe. But boy, is it different from anything we normally think about today. When we think of tithing, we think usually of writing a check or doing a transfer or giving cash equivalent to 10% of our income. But this tithe was something that you were to bring to a designated place and use it to have a communal meal, a celebration in the presence of the Lord and in the community of faith. And yet you should go to the tabernacle, and that's where you would have the communal meal, the great bringing together of the whole nation of Israel to make sacrifices and celebrate, most likely the Passover festival, as it would become. Now there's more. Verse 27 at the end of that reminded us that the tribe of Levi were not given any land, so the people, wherever they were to support the Levites. With this tithe, they were also called to support the Levites. The chapter then closes out by saying, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment and are inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, the widows who live in the towns, may come and eat and be satisfied, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands. So part of this money here is revealed as it needs to be given, another tithe, if you like, to support the Levites. Just the same principle as supporting the preacher, your minister, or people who serve in your other church, but also for the vulnerable, the fatherless, the widows, and the strangers within your gates. Now, it's commonly understood that there were, in fact, 3 tithes in the Old Testament. So what's revealed here that there are 2 tithes at 10%, and every third year there is this third tithe, which is for the Levites and the vulnerable people, and every third year another 10%. So, if you were practicing tithing according to the way the Old Testament describes it here, you would in fact be giving 20% plus 10% every third year, so you'd actually be giving 23 and a third percent. I have to say that most preachers who preach tithing don't do the math. In fact, they're happy if they can just get people to do the 10%. But we need to remember that tithing wasn't just something that was revealed in the law. Indeed, we see Abraham tithe and Jacob tithe before these laws were established. The problem is tithing, for many people wanting to approach this aspect from a New Testament perspective, the cold hard fact is that tithing isn't mentioned at all in the New Testament. The scriptures do say, as the Lord has prospered you, give and do it with a cheerful heart. So I've been saying it for years that we don't have to tithe a percentage under the law. That's very clear. However, when you consider that the law was given and that Abraham and Jacob did give a tithe of 10% before the law was placed, maybe that's not a bad place to start. But the overarching principle is that you should give as the Lord has prospered you, meaning proportionately, and you should give with a cheerful heart. Okay, let me sum up, and I'll do that by asking, well, some penetrating questions, I hope. What's really going on in this chapter? Well, on the face of it, first of all, it's telling us 3 things. Firstly, don't get involved in pagan practices. Secondly, don't eat things that are designated as unclean fruit. And third, that they should tithe. Tithes, give tithes, plural. And that would have been equivalent to 23 and a third percent. Okay, if that's what he said to the people at that time, why did he tell them to do these things? Well, as I suggested when I started out, I'm saying, look, I've chosen you. You are different. You are to be seen as different from the people around you. I believe the point of this chapter is that those who know the Lord are always meant to be unique, different, and distinctive from the people around them because of their relationship with God. Their lives must demonstrate this difference in some way. Now, in the ancient world, other nations looked at the Israelites. They would have said immediately, by these choices and principles they are applying, they would say, boy, these people really are different. They don't do any of the religious things we do. For them at that time, they were saying, look, they don't cut and scar themselves. They don't shave half their head when someone dies. They certainly don't recognize the gods we do. And they don't even eat the stuff that we enjoy. They're different. They look different. They behave different. And they're different because they're devoted to their God. They even give tithes to their God. And I think that's what's really going on in this chapter. But if that's what's going on, how do we apply it to us today? Well, clearly we too are called not to participate in pagan practices. That's a good start. But can you eat your bacon sandwich in the morning? Are you not allowed to eat shrimp or lobster? Well, none of that applies anymore. We know that because the New Testament clearly says so. So that may be a relief to some of you who enjoy those things. But what about the tithing thing? We're not even legally under that. We're under the law of grace, although we are called to give proportionately, happily, and generously to the Lord. So how do we apply all this today? Well, the New Testament also teaches that we too are to be different. Now, there are many passages that say how we could choose to be different, but listen to what Paul says about this, how we might be seen to be different from those around us. He says the point of this is, he says that you may be blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Is that not saying you should be different? That's how we're to be different. We're to be different from those around us. People that Paul says are a crooked and perverse generation. Would you say we live among crooked and perverse generation today? Hello? Definitely. And it seems to me things get more perverse day by day. Isn't that the truth? All right? So you're to be blameless amongst the sinful generation that we live in, which means that we shouldn't participate in any of that stuff, any of that stupidity, any of those things that are an abominable, detestable thing to the Lord. The principle of Deuteronomy chapter 4 is the main issue, is about us being different, unique, distinct as Christian believers. Paul says that the thing that makes you different and distinct and unique are the things that make us different to those people who are around us. So what are his specifics? What makes us different? Well, if we were to choose Philippians chapter 2, listen to what he says here. This is the way we can be different. To do all things without murmuring and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. There it is again. He says if you want to show you're different, well, here's a couple of things. Don't murmur, don't grumble, don't complain, and don't dispute with one another. Don't get involved in arguments. Just don't argue. God takes a dim view of complaining. When I taught our way through the book of Numbers last month, boy, did we get the fact that God doesn't like grumbling in spades. The Israelites were always complaining, and we saw that God come down on them pretty hard again and again. So here's what it is. You want to be different in this age, in your generation, be distinct, then stop complaining, stop grumbling, and stop fighting and arguing with other Christians. And in that same passage he says, instead, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. If Jesus could do all of that, we should do something similar. Someone has written, and I don't know once, some time ago, one who suffers a little does not groan in the presence of one who suffers much. One who has sore feet would not whine in the presence of someone who had no feet at all. You see, a sensitive Christian citizen would not complain about these things. They wouldn't complain about having to pay taxes if you were standing at the graveside of a soldier who had just died for his country and paid the greatest price of all. And we too, as Christian believers, we are those who live in the presence of God, in the presence of his Holy Spirit, acknowledging the life of the one, his Son, who died for us. And that should put us far away from any thoughts of complaining, about disputing with other believers about things in our lives. And that is what ultimately can make us different, by simply being thankful for that and living in the light of that. Thanks for being with me today. Called today's message, Strange Ways to Make a Profit. It's actually the next 2 days. And because we're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 15. And today we're going to look at the first 11 verses. And we're going to look at some principles of how we can gain financially. In fact, gain prosperity in every area of our lives. Now, if you want to gain financially, there are some very basic fundamental principles that I believe we can all follow. Everyone should know them. There's no deep, dark financial secret going on here. It's very simple, straightforward things like working hard, saving money, spending less than you earn, and not spending money foolishly or impulsively. These basic principles will work if you want to accumulate some money or gain some sort of financial independence in your life. Now, we've been going through the book of Deuteronomy, and it seems to me that Moses now talks about the way that you can gain prosperity in your life to God's people, and he offers a very strange formula. So what I want to do in the next 2 episodes over the next couple of days is look at the 3, well, I have to say they're counterintuitive ways that Moses says that we can profit in life. So first we're going to talk about debt, which we look at today, and then tomorrow we're going to talk about slavery, and we're going to talk about the principles of how to treat the best of what God gives us in life. So as we go through these three topics in this chapter, keep in mind that Moses is really showing us via the ancient Israelites how they can succeed and profit financially and prosper in the new land they're going into. Now, some of them may be strange, but I do believe that these principles, when understood properly, can apply and can benefit us today as well. So let's look at the first of these three principles here in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, welcome friends, and let me start by reading for you just verse 1, which says, "At the end of 7 years, you must cancel debts." Now, he's saying this, it's very simple, it's very straightforward. If someone owes you money, then after 7 years, you forgive their debt. It's called the sabbatical year. It seems to me that very clearly this verse is saying there should be an unconditional remission of debt. Now, as I'll explain in a minute, this is pertaining to a fellow believer, a fellow Israelite in the context of what's been taught here. Now, some people look at this and say, well, they're not comfortable with it, and they say, well, it can't possibly mean that. It doesn't mean you totally forgive debt. Some people actually, I've heard them teach that it means you actually just suspend debt for a year. But notice verse 1 says it's very clear. The word accurately translated for us is you must cancel debts. Now, some also say, well, no, this only applies to those who are in poverty. Some say the correct interpretation is it only applies to releasing a debt temporarily or to those amongst the community who are very poor. However, the most common interpretation, but also perhaps the hardest to accept and understand in our modern world, but I feel we have to accept that this is talking about the forgiveness of debt and that it should be complete and permanent. Now, there are 5 reasons why I believe this position is correct when interpreting this passage within the context of which it is given. The view is consistent with the generosity of the Lord that we've seen him express towards Israel all through their story so far. Secondly, it's also going to be consistent that the statements will come after this verse, especially as when we get to verses 9 through 11 in the later part of today's message. Thirdly, the practice of cancelling debt permanently in the 7th year sits within the context where Israel were going to have the extravagant practice, if you like, commanded for the main year of Jubilee, where every 50 years the land reverted back to the original people who owned it, and this was in some way meant to prepare Israel for that huge event. Embed the principle in their minds. So the forgiving of debt every 7 years was a preparation for this bigger event which comes around every 50 years. Also, fourthly, permanent cancellation of debt would prevent anybody from falling into abject poverty or slavery within the nation. And then finally, fifth reason, the potential for the possible incredible wealth in the land of Israel that could be gathered into a tiny percent of the people meant that this principle of the cancellation of debts would stop those extremes happening at both ends of the scale. But what we can say clearly, looking at this passage, which in the context of the time it's talking to that nation, it's very clearly saying to me that it's saying this cancellation of debt on the 7th year is to be permanent and complete. So the Lord is saying every 7th year, if you've loaned money to some other fellow Israelite, now that will come clear in a minute, that's what it's talking about here, then you are to completely cancel and forgive that debt. Now, what's so amazing about this command, is that we need to notice it's given under the law. It's not given under the grace of the New Testament. Now, I might expect something like this. We almost would expect something like this to be in the New Testament, to see things like this under grace. But we normally think of the Mosaic law as being rigid and firm. Yet here it is, this act of grace demonstrated, commanded under the Mosaic law. The idea that you completely forgive a person's debt. But there's more. Look at the next verse. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelites. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for cancelling debts has been proclaimed. So this expands upon the simple statement of verse 1 by saying that you can't require it of your fellow Israelites, anyone you've lent money to, and you can't go after their family because the debt is cancelled. You're not able to cancel it with one member of a family and then, for instance, go chase their brother for it. In other words, and it seems to me that this is really clinching the fact that what is called for here is the complete permanent forgiveness of a debt, and that you can't go after the wider family. That underlines the point that this is a complete cancellation for me. Now, I want to make it clear we're talking about financial debt here, but I think there's an application for us today that isn't quite related to financial debt. The picture being painted here, well, I can't help but see it when you think about the forgiveness of sins. Is it not true that we are completely forgiven? The debt of sin is completely cancelled for us. That's the principle being established here. When I became a Christian, did God forgive me of some of my sins or of all of my sins? To understand grace means to understand that Christ died for all your sins. And by the way, when he died for your sins, the Bible tells us that includes your past, present, and future sins. Everything. So the New Testament teaches that. Actually, maybe you're wondering, where does it teach that? And where does it say that explicitly? Well, let me just give you an example. The one verse that says that for us absolutely explicitly is Colossians 2, verse 13, where it says, "When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ, and he forgave us all our sins." There it is. So at the moment an individual comes to Christ, all is forgiven. Now, there's another verse in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, which says, "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." So there we have it again. I just thought I'd drop those in before we continue back in Deuteronomy. So let's take a continued look and pick up verses 3 to 5. It says, "You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. However, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you, if only you fully obey the Lord your God and be careful to follow all these commands I am giving you today." So clearly these verses make it explicitly clear that what was said in verse 1 and 2, that this situation is only talking about this requirement to be about and among Israelites, because it's noted here that you can still continue to charge a foreigner. So the sabbatical cancellation does not apply to foreigners, does not apply to unbelievers. Now, if you recall the land, also, we were told earlier in Numbers that the land was to lie dormant also for every 7th year. It was to be left fallow for one entire year. Now, one argument is that the foreigners didn't do that. They didn't live under that way. So that's why they didn't have to suspend their debt. Only the obedient Israelite would have been leaving the land fallow, so it would have been helpful to have the suspension of the debt to allow for that break in harvests. Now, notice he also says this, and this is very important. "If you do this, the Lord will greatly bless you." This is important because the motivation, or the blessing for doing this rather, he says this, "Provided you are careful to observe all these things that I have commanded you, and you do that, and forgive their debt, then the Lord promises that he will bless you." So there's another thing embedded in this passage, is the fact that God is saying that if you do these things, if you all did these things, then there would be no need for poor people among you. So if they practiced it, everyone practiced it, that principle would mean that there would be no abject poverty in the land. Now, verse 4 is suggesting that if they, as ancient Israel, did it, it would reduce, if not entirely eliminate, poverty amongst the people, because, of course, the poorest would have their debts forgiven. Then in verse 6 he says, "For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. And you will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you." So please note, this is important. It says, verse 3, you can lend to a foreigner, and in verse 6, it talks about many nations. So you can just go out in the world and lend money and do what you wish and have business according to whatever principles, whatever way the world wants to do business, and the Lord will indeed bless you. But don't hold your own people to repay on the seventh year. The Lord is establishing a different way of approaching these things, and if you do it his way, he will bless you just as he's promised. As a matter of fact, you have to note it says you shall lend to many nations, but don't borrow from them. So if you need to borrow money, then you should only go to a fellow Israelite, a fellow believer. By doing so, you will in effect reign over many nations, and they're not able to then manipulate, control, rule over you, as it's described here. Now, this is really interesting to me. There's also a proverb that says the lender is a servant to the borrower, and it seems to me here this is being applied not to just individuals, but to nations as well. So the point here, I think, God is saying to nations, to his people, don't borrow from a nation and put yourself in debt to them. You can lend them in money, but don't borrow from them. And that was a principle, and that was how the world economic system worked up until well after the Second World War. Now, I don't often get political about anything I say about in the Bible, but I think there's a principle here, which if you look at the debt of the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States, do you know who owns most of the debt, the huge amounts of debt, the trillions of dollars and pounds of debts that we have as nations? Who owns the largest portion of it? China. Now, a lot of people don't like to talk about this. The news media don't talk about it very much, and Christians don't talk about it at all. But at one point, China will probably one day want to call in that debt, and then we will be completely beholden to them. So this is why I believe he says to God's people, look, you are about to enter this promised land. You can lend money to the foreigners and the nations there, but you can't borrow from other nations. You've got to support financially, generously support one another. And I find that fascinating, very interesting in the age in which we live. Now look at verse 7. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. So this is sort of reiterating the things he said before, only he's putting the emotional heart behind it. He's saying, don't harden your heart, open your hands, have a willing heart. In other words, have a good attitude about being generous to people. It seems to me that what he's saying is if you practice what I'm saying, then the Lord indeed is going to bless you. But in order for the Lord to bless you, you need to allow him to instill a spirit of generosity within you, so you're going to be free. And by doing that and not being tied to money and by being generous, you are actually being freed from the potential danger of developing a love and unhealthy attachment to money and material things. By being generous to others, you won't be clinging to material things, and that in itself will enable you to be even more generous. Back in Proverbs again, it says 11:24, one man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. So Solomon here in his Proverbs, I think, is echoing this passage. I'm sure he knew of it. And he's basically saying be generous, and those who are generous are going to gain more in the long run. They're going to be blessed. They're going to experience prosperity. Now back in Deuteronomy, in verse 9, Moses goes on to say, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The seventh year, the year of cancelling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill towards the needy among the fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of a sin. So don't hold back from lending. Don't hold back from giving. Don't hold back from supporting people just because the year of Jubilee is round the corner. Continue, verse 10, to give generously to them and to do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. So the argument is clear. You need to do this and to continue to do this among your fellow believers, Israelites in this case. Don't develop a hard heart. Don't clench your fist, but give generously and continue to give generously no matter what year in this sabbatical cycle it is. Now, several times we've seen in this text this emphasis of the promise that the Lord will bless you. Back in verse 4, it said the Lord will greatly bless you. And here in verse 10, it says it again. It says God will bless you if you're doing these things. So you are urged to do this because he promises prosperity to all who do this and apply these principles. Not just financial prosperity, but in every aspect of life. The principle of taking care of each other financially is something that we need to understand and to practice. And indeed, you could say the Jewish people have pretty consistently done that over the years. And that's a lesson many cultures could learn from. But now verse 11, the final one we're looking at today, concludes this opening section by stating, and putting this caveat in, that there will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites, those who are poor and needy in your land. So early in verse 4, it appeared he mentioned that there would be no poor in the land if these commandments were followed, or there would be no need for there to be poor if these commandments were followed. But now it says, actually, that there will always be poor among you. Now, you might look at those verses first and think that's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? But I think it's not. It's pretty straightforward. Verse 4 is saying that if you were completely obedient, poverty would clearly be eradicated. Be careful to obey the Lord, the voice of the Lord, it says. So there's an element of obedience here, saying that complete obedience by every single person to this command could potentially eliminate poverty. But verse 11 completely realistically acknowledges the reality that complete obedience to this by everyone is unlikely. Hence, understand that there will always be poor people amongst you. So both verses are indeed and can be seen as true, providing they're held in the context that each verse is writing about. Now, I said in the introduction, I mentioned how this idea and the three ideas, the other two we're looking at tomorrow, the cancellation of debt today, how they all seem strange way in which God says he's going to help us gain, profit, and prosper. But Moses is teaching us this is a principle in one way in which we can gain in life, and the way to do that is actually to give. The principle here is to give away out of the blessings God is giving us. Very specifically here, cancelling debt. If someone needs money, lend to them, enable them to invest and build up that aspect of their life, but in the 7th year you must forgive the debt. Now, of course, that seems counterintuitive, but Moses is saying, you know what? That will work because God says it will work, and God has promised to bless you if you do it and apply that principle. And we've seen that repeated several times in this passage. Over and over again, it clearly says God will bless you. So it may seem strange to be giving away money, in a sense, forgiving a debt, and how that can possibly lead to financial gains. Listen to Proverbs again, chapter 19, verse 17. It says, he who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he has given. Do you hear that? That proverb, I believe, captures and summarizes the entire first 11 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 15 perfectly for me. He who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and the Lord will pay back what he has given. There's a biblical principle, and it's called the law of sowing and reaping. And it is that if you sow abundantly, you will reap abundantly. if you sow sparingly, you will reap sparingly. And this applies not only to sin, but also to financial matters, but very specifically in giving. The principle embedded in the Mosaic Law in Deuteronomy 15 and in the book of Proverbs is if you give to the poor, if you lend to a brother in need, and then you forgive the debt, the Lord will bless you and he will repay. God calls us to live our lives with open hearts and generous spirits. And in his wisdom here, he has revealed for us a blueprint, not only for individual blessings, but for the prosperity of our entire community. Imagine a world where there was no one amongst us burdened by the weight of insurmountable debt. This radical generosity is not just a call to financially help other people, but it is a call to a completely transformative way of living. God promises that if we give to the needy, if we support the poor, he will then bless us in all the works of his hands, as it said here. So this is not about God just adding wealth or building up your bank accounts or investment portfolios endlessly, as some present this principle. In fact, I would say his blessings mentioned here are not primarily about our own personal material wealth. That, of course, may very well be a side benefit, a side effect out of living us this way, but the blessings overflowing out of this is into every aspects of our life. It will enrich our relationships, our work, and our spiritual journey. In this, there's a call to generosity, a call to align, to have the same posture of heart as God himself, which is a heart that does not hold back, a heart which gives and gives abundantly. Just as he's forgiven us and freed us from the debt of sin through Jesus Christ, we are invited to extend that same grace to others in every aspect of our life. This is the divine economy of God, where, so different from the world, the more we give, the more we are blessed. Here's the key: in order that we can continue to bless others. Remember, when we open our hands and our hearts to our brothers and sisters, we are in fact reflecting the very nature of God to them, showing the character of God to them. Our acts of kindness and generosity can become a beacon of his love and even mercy in a world that is clouded, controlled even by selfishness and greed. We become instruments of his blessings when we give and support others, and that creates a ripple effect that can transform their lives, our lives, and indeed our entire communities. So we're going to pause here today, but at this point I would ask that you think on this and commit to trying to live out these principles. Let us be known as people who give freely, readily, and love other and support other people abundantly. And in doing so, we're not only obeying God's commands here, but also putting ourselves in a position in order to receive his bountiful blessings, that we may indeed be able to help others even more. The call here is to live our lives and let it be a testament to the truth of that principle. You've heard it, I'm sure, before, comes straight out of Scripture, that it is indeed more blessed to give than receive. And you know what? I believe that if we do this and we apply this counterintuitive principle, then the peace and the prosperity promised here in Deuteronomy chapter 15 will not only fill our own homes and our own lives, but our churches and our communities as we choose to walk in obedience to the message God has given to his people and how they should live here. So go forth, have a generous heart, knowing that God's blessings are upon you. Let his love, his character shine through those active kindnesses that you perform to others. Credit him for what you're doing, and do that especially with a focus among your local Christian communities. Thanks for being with me today. Imagine waking up one morning to find that all your debts have gone, completely erased, all your financial burdens lifted, and a fresh start laid out before you. It's a scenario that most of us can only dream about. But what if I told you that this dream was a reality in ancient Israel? What if I told you that God, in his incredible wisdom and compassion, instilled a system where every 7 years slaves were set free, debts were forgiven, and lives were restored? Counterintuitive though it may be, these were revealed as ways in which everyone could experience blessing and prosperity in their lives. Today we're continuing our journey through Deuteronomy and continuing our study of chapter 15. And this time I'm going to look at the second half of the chapter, verses 12 to 23, where God continues to lay out his radical, transformative plan for both freedom, redemption, and prosperity for his people. Now, this passage isn't just a glimpse into an ancient tradition. It's a reminder, a powerful reminder of God's heart towards his people. A heart that longs for them, a heart that longs for all of us who know him to experience freedom, restoration, and the opportunity for new beginnings. So as we explore these verses today, we're going to uncover further principles that I believe can transform how we live our lives today. In this chapter, we'll see how God is called to release slaves and forgive debts, and to give of our best to him, challenge us to live out our life in both profound but yet practical ways. What we're about to discover is not just history, it's God's invitation to experience his grace and extend that radical grace in our own lives to others. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now, I mentioned there were 3 things disclosed in this chapter as ways God would plan to prosper his people. The first is the release of those in debt, and we looked at that yesterday. The second, today, is going to be the freeing of people who are bonded, who are held in slavery, and we'll begin looking at that now. But before we even do that, I feel I need to explain exactly what the Old Testament means when it talks about slavery, sometimes translated bondservants, and how it applied amongst the Israelite nations. This brings up, of course, the whole issue of slavery and what the Bible has to say about it. Does the Bible promote slavery? I need to first of all say, before we do anything else, definitely not. It does not. Well then, what does the Bible say about it if it's not promoting it? What exactly is going on here? Now, when we see the word slave, or the term slavery is used, in our mind, one thought is formed, usually around the abomination of slavery that we saw in America and Europe, roughly prior to the American Civil War, that thing that was funded by the Africans' slave trade, promoted and exploited by mainly first European countries up until the abolitionist movement by the likes of William Wilberforce in the 18th century, and then again also in the United States prior to the process beginning of the abolition of the slave movement there following the Civil War. Now, I would like to simply point out a couple of things. First, it was the Christians who first freed the slaves in Europe. That process started in England among evangelical Christians many years ago. That movement spread to the United States and around the world. In fact, the United States fought a civil war pretty much over this particular issue, if I understand my American history properly. But I would also like to point out that slavery exists today in some parts of the world, but not legally in any Christian culture or country. Now, in the Old Testament, there was a form of slavery, probably better described as bonded service, that existed at that time. But it is a long way off of what might pop into your mind, or what you might recognize as what you thought what slavery and what the slave trade represented in Europe and America. If God's word has been followed truly and accurately, then this later version of slavery that we have in mind, represented by the slave trade, would never have been allowed. In the Old Testament law, An Israelite could end up in bonded service for one of two reasons. Now, the term is often translated as slavery because that is how the King James originally translated, but there are two words used in the Bible. One is slavery, one is bondservant, in relation to when it's talking about the children of Israel and the nation of Israelite. It's actually talking about a type of bond service. And when the word slavery is used, it's usually talking about situations or other cultures that are forcibly taking people's freedom away and enforcing them into forms of employment, much as happened to Joseph when he was taken into Egypt, or it's described of other nations around Israel at that time. Now, in the Old Testament law, the Israelites themselves could end up in slavery. Let me rephrase that, could end up in bonded service for one of two reasons. One was because of debt, and the other was because of crime. So in the event of financial problems or a debt that someone knew they weren't going to be able to repay, an individual could themselves voluntarily sell themselves into slavery to pay off their debt, to avoid the repercussions for both themselves and, more importantly, for the fact that their situation would then not affect their wider family. In other situations, there were cases where a criminal could be placed into the custody of a master who would reimburse the victim of the offender's crime. This is whereby the Levitical principle of paying back 4 times, up to 4 times, what had been stolen should be repaid to the victim, and if that person wasn't able to do that, they would be put into a form of bonded labour in order to work off that fine/debt. Now, those in that type of slavery could only be forced to work a maximum of 6 years, after which they had to be freed. However, there's many cases where it seems that people in such service, bonded service, would stay on as part of the extended family by some sort of agreement. Old Testament law provided for the protection for these type of people in bonded service from them being exploited by oppressive masters, in that certain rules were applied. They were only allowed to work a maximum of 6 days out of 7, the Sabbath being guaranteed as a day of rest, and at the period could be a maximum of 6 years. So this type of bonded service being discussed here in the Old Testament is not the type of slavery and cannot be compared to the type of slavery that we saw in Europe and the New World up until the 18th century. Okay, with that in mind, let's dive into Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 23, where we find God's instruction on releasing these Hebrew slaves, in other words, Israelite slaves, after the 6 years of service. And as I said in the introduction to this passage, this in fact is the opposite of what many people think it means when they approach it. It actually reveals important insights into God's heart for justice, compassion, and the ability for full restoration. So verse 12 begins with the basic directive. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. So you can see, even though it uses the word slavery in translation, this is a different thing. So it's very clear in this passage and others in the Mosaic Law that when it's talked about here, it refers to either voluntary service or indebted servitude. That's where the individual themselves sell themselves in order to work for someone else. And it's saying that after 6 years, they're to be set free. Now, during those 6 years, the owner must provide minimal care for them, but in the 7th year, they gain their freedom again. Now, to understand this better, I think we can consider some modern parallels. For example, when someone enlists in military service, they essentially willingly give up their freedom for a period of time, they obey orders, and they follow a strict schedule that is not even set of themselves. You might even say in some professional sports, athletes are placed under contract and must adhere to the team's command until their contract expires. They must be there, not only play the matches, but also meet the training schedules and other stipulations of the team that they play for. So these analogies, I think, help us grasp the concept of this form of servitude that existed in ancient Israel. It goes on in verses 13 or 14. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, or your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. So these verses emphasize that even at the end of this service, when setting this bond servant free, you mustn't send them away empty-handed. Instead, they should be supplied with something from either the owner's flock, the threshing floor, or the winepress, perhaps suggesting something of the fruits of the labor for where they worked for that other individual. So this ensures that the freed individual has some resources to establish a new life after this, preventing them from immediately becoming destitute. Again, this provision reflects God's generosity and his desire for social equity. And verse 5 reminds Israel of their own history in embedding this idea. It says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you, and he provided for you. They are to do the same for others. Poignant, important application of this principle is found in how we treat others as God has treated us. This idea has embedded within it the whole aspect of God's dealing with us always have an endpoint where forgiveness and grace can be experienced. Remembering what God has done for us, treating others with the same mercy and kindness we have received from him will indeed really transform not only our personal relationships, but I would argue our communities as well. Verses 16 to 18 adds more detail. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you, because he has grown to love you and your family, and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand, and the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. So again, the underlying principle here is clear. Generosity and fairness in all things, particularly in our relations to others, leads to God's blessing for everyone. The passage teaches that giving generously, even when it seems from our point sacrificial, does seem counterintuitive. Handing that formerly indebted person their freedom back over to them should be something that's done willingly, because by doing so, it invites God's blessing. Okay, that's the second principle for societal and personal prosperity. The first was the releasing of debts. The second is setting the bonded servants free. Let's conclude our time together in this chapter and consider the third. Now, these last verses, 19 to 23, discusses what I'm calling the sanctification of the firstborn animals, etc., highlighting God's claim on the first and best of everything we have. So I'll read this entire closing verses for you, and then we'll take a look at what they might mean. Set apart for the Lord your God every firstborn male of your herds and flocks. Do not put the firstborn of your cows to work, and do not shear the firstborn of your sheep. Each year you and your family are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose. If an animal has a defect, is lame or blind, or any serious flaw, you must not sacrifice it to the Lord. You are to eat it in your own towns. Both the ceremonially unclean and the clean may eat it, as if it were a gazelle or a deer. But you must not eat the blood, poured out in the ground like water. Okay, the principle here is the firstborn animals belong to God, and we're not to use those for personal gain. Instead, they are to be set apart, sanctified, it's called, and presented to the Lord. This meant not working these firstborn animals, not shearing them if the wool of that animal was there for profit. The Israelites instead were to bring these firstborn animals to the sanctuary, where God would designate that they could be used to share a communal meal with the entire widened family. This practice emphasizes the importance of recognizing that the best of ourselves belongs to the Lord. But also this practice would reinforce the idea in the Israelite mindset that they needed to be totally dependent on God and not acknowledge his provision. By giving the first and the best, they were indeed doing this. God always requires the best from his people, to the point where if any of these firstborn animals would appear to have a defect, they could not be offered in sacrifice. Instead, these animals could be consumed at home by the owners or even shared with anybody else, thus avoiding the situation where people would deliberately set apart the worst of their provision rather than the best. So the principle is clear. The firstborn, the best, belongs to God, and the Israelites are to honor their God by always giving the best to him. This act of giving back to God not only would show their devotion, but would also, as we've all of these prescriptions, would actually bring blessings upon them. The communal meal at the sanctuary would serve as a reminder of God's provision and the entire dependence of the whole wider family and community on him. Now, this passage, I think, also has significant implications for us today, if we dig a little bit behind the meaning. Now, while we may not be under the Mosaic law, the principles of giving our best to God and honoring him with our resources and recognizing his provision for us obviously completely remains relevant for us today. Now, it's not just about giving money, but it's also about giving your time, your talents, the best of what you have, the best of the abilities of what you have. God calls us to be generous in everything we do, and in doing so, we are promised his blessings in return. So in conclusion, when looking across this whole chapter we've spent 2 days in, the whole chapter that we've looked at, this whole chapter challenges us to embrace a lifestyle of generosity, justice, and compassion. By releasing people from debt, by setting bond servants free, by providing for their needs when we do that, and of course by dedicating our best to God, we align ourselves with his heart and invite his abundant blessings into our lives. These actions are not just legal requirements set out for an ancient people, but they're expressions of God's heart for justice, compassion, and generosity, and we're meant to extrapolate that out of this teaching still today. By following these principles, these commands, the Israelites were assured of God's blessing, and we too can be today. Now, of course, we live in a different context today, but the principle of God's blessing in response to our generosity to others and the other principles here still definitely applies. In the New Testament, it echoed in many places. For example, in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6 to 8, we see Paul write about this law of sowing and reaping, and he encourages believers to give generously, cheerfully, promising that God will provide abundantly for every good work that they want to do. So primarily that blessing is poured out into our lives. Yes, we'll benefit, but we're also meant to use it to then continue to bless others with it, to do greater works of blessings for others and for God. So as we reflect in this chapter, let's try and embrace the timeless principle that's revealed here of giving our best to God, trusting in his promise that if we do that, he will bless us in order that we will continue to do that more, forming a sort of virtuous circle, if you like, whether it's through your finances, through your time, or your talents. Well, it shouldn't be or. All of these may be brought to him in ways that honor him. And our generosity of heart and service, I believe, guarantees us that we will experience the fullness of his blessing in our lives. So friends, the recommendation is to give generously and to do it with joy. Remember, there's this principle of sowing and reaping being revealed here. And of course, it's said to apply to finances and giving to the Lord, as in passages like Corinthians. But as in verse 8 of 2 Corinthians chapter 9, God will not only bless you, but God is able to make all grace abound towards you. So when you give money, the promise is God will provide for you. He ensures that you will have all you need ultimately to continue doing good works for others and of service. Essentially, he's saying when you give, he will supply you with more so you can keep giving. This isn't about, as I said yesterday, building up your own personal bank account. God's blessing comes in order that we can bless others. In fact, I would say if your motivation into building prosperity from that perspective is your whole focus, then God by nature will probably not. You will not see that happen. To illustrate this further, let me close by turning to another letter of Paul's, Philippians chapter 4. Now, the entire book is essentially a thank you note from Paul to the church in Philippi for the financial support they've given him. In chapter 4, verse 15, Paul acknowledges that they were the only church that consistently sent him money as he travelled around. He wasn't seeking their gifts for personal gain, but he wanted them to be blessed because of their generosity towards him. And in verse 18, Paul mentions that their gift delivered through this guy Epaphroditus was, as he described it, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord. Paul then makes an incredible promise after acknowledging this gift. In verse 18, he makes a promise to them in verse 19. My God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. But notice he doesn't say out of his riches, but according to his riches. Now, it's one thing for a rich man to give money from his account. A rich man can easily write a check, and it may be a high percentage of his or a low percentage, we'll never know. But if we give an order according to the wealth they possess, in other words, proportionally, then if someone has millions, giving according to their riches means that they're going to give in a way that reflects their vast resources. And this is what God promises to do to those who give to his work. The message is clear. God has an abundance of resources available and riches to give to us. So Paul's message is clear. When you support the God's work, God will meet all your needs, your Christian needs, abundantly. And this principle is echoed not just here in Philippians, but also in Corinthians 9, emphasizing that God's provision always follows on from our generosity. Now, while we must not give solely in order to receive, it's undeniable in the scriptures, I believe, that God blesses those who bless others financially. The principle is woven through the Bible, and it's something that we should all embrace wholeheartedly. So, friends, let's not just take a few mental notes from today's podcasts. Let's give generously and joyfully, knowing that God's blessings will follow our generosity. This is the heart of true giving. It's not just words, but it's actions that reflects God's love and compassion. Give to those in need. Give to your brothers and sisters, both of your financial resources and others who need your support. Give to your local church communities. Now, as we close off our reflection on this chapter, let's just take a moment to appreciate the wisdom that is embedded in this passage and is still relevant today. God's commands here regarding debt, slavery, and firstborn animals, they might seem distant in context from our modern lives, but they're principles that still should resonate deeply with you today. Imagine that society where generosity and justice are not just ideals, but are the practice norms of everyone. A society where debts are forgiven, slaves are set free, and the firstborn, in other words, the very best of every aspect of our lives, are offered to God by all people, and done so with gratitude and a happy heart. In this vision revealed here, every act of giving is not seen as a loss, but a gain. That's the part that's counterintuitive. The sacrifice is a gain, not a loss, because it aligns with God's promises of blessing, and that's with his sacrifice for us bought on our behalf. When God instructs us to release our debtors, free our servants, He's not just asking us to act out of kindness. He's inviting us into a cycle of His divine blessing. By releasing others, we are opening ourselves up to receive more from Him. More grace, more provision, more opportunities to do good and to do His will. And as we honour God with our best, our time, our talents and our resources, we are also assured that He will supply our needs abundantly. He doesn't just give us from His resources, but He gives according to His limitless resources. That's what Paul tells us here. Let this be an encouragement to you. Any act of generosity is never in vain. Every gift, every act of kindness, every effort to bless another person is a seed sown into God's fertile ground, and in return He promises to offer you His grace and always to provide for all your needs. So remember that your generosity in life is simply there to reflect God's character and invites His blessing into your life. Give generously, friends. Give joyfully, friends, and trust that God is faithful to His promise revealed here. In God's economy, giving is not a loss, never a loss, but simply a doorway, a gateway into blessing. So rejoice in the knowledge that any generous acts are making a difference in the world, both in the lives of others, but also in the unfolding of God's plan. And that plan is in our lives and in the lives of those around us. So give of all of your best of yourself, all of your best resources, and give with hearts full of joy, knowing that as you bless others, God's promises are true and His blessings in return are sure. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, that's it for today. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. That way you need never miss another single episode. If you'd like to experience an ad-free version of this podcast and an early release of it, you can do that by joining our Patreon community. It's free to join over there. You can follow me over there at no cost, and you'll receive an ad-free version of every single episode, early release, as well as the same and ad-free version of my church history podcast that's released every month. There's also opportunities there to access loads of about 100 hours of free teaching resources over there now, looking at areas of where the Bible and Christianity intersect with modern ideas of psychology, philosophy, even politics and science. But not just where they intersect, but also where they conflict. So if you're interested in all that sort of stuff, you can find it over there. Some of that extra bonus material is initially put on Patreon as a thank you for those people who are choosing to select a tier where they support this ministry and enable me to produce this podcast and make them freely available all around the world. But after 12 months on the site as a patron-only access content, they're then released for everyone and made available widely as well. That's how the seed of this ministry works. That's how I have been enabled to enable thousands of people around the world in over 190 countries of the world to listen to this podcast for free on all the various platforms. You're also able to reach out and connect with me there, ask me a question, or get into a conversation with me over there. But wherever and however you're accessing this podcast, you are very welcome. And I really appreciate it. And thank you for being here. And I do trust I'll see you back here again very soon on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.